Hey everybody, and welcome back to Hi and Kai. I'm Hi,
And I'm Kai.
ready for another deep dive into software.
Absolutely. Today we're talking all about the ambassador pattern.
Okay, cool. So what is the ambassador pattern?
Well, imagine this. You have an application, right?
Mm,
And it needs to talk to a bunch of different services.
like databases, APIs, stuff like that?
Yeah, exactly. The ambassador pattern is like giving your app its own diplomat.
A diplomat.
Yeah, to handle all that communication and make everything run smoothly.
I like that. So it's like a middleman for my application.
Exactly. So instead of your application connecting to these external services directly, you introduce this ambassador.
Okay.
It's a separate service that sits between your application and the outside world.
Okay, I see. Why not just let my application talk directly to those other services? What's the point of this ambassador thing?
Right, good question. So there are a few scenarios where this pattern is super useful.
Okay.
Like, let's say you've got this older application that's a pain to change.
Legacy system.
Yeah, maybe it's written in a language that doesn't really play well with modern security stuff.
Ah.
Or maybe you have like a ton of different applications.
Oh, different languages.
Exactly, and you need a consistent way to handle things like logging or monitoring or even security across all of them.
Ah, so it's like a universal adapter that lets all these different applications talk the same language.
Yeah, you got it. And because the ambassador is this separate service, you can update it, you can add new features, all without actually touching the code of your main application.
That makes sense, especially when you're dealing with these, legacy systems.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm seeing how this could be really useful, but what are some like concrete examples of the benefits?
Well, one big one is resilience. Like your application can suddenly become way more resilient
Okay.
because the ambassador can implement things like circuit breaking,
Hmm.
to prevent those cascading failures when one service goes down.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it can handle retries to give your application a second chance to connect.
So it's like a safety net for your application.
Exactly. And it can also make your application much more secure.
Okay.
The ambassador can handle things like encryption, authentication, authorization.
Oh, wow.
All that communication is protected.
So I don't have to worry about implementing it for each application separately.
Nope, because it's all centralized in the ambassador.
It's like having a dedicated security team just for your entire system.
Exactly. And it also makes things so much easier when it comes to monitoring and observability.
Right.
The ambassador is collecting all those metrics and logs about, the communication happening. So you
Yeah.
get these valuable insights into how your app's performing.
Okay, that's super helpful. This is all sounding really great. But before we get too carried away, can you tell me how it actually works in practice? Where does this ambassador live, and how does my application even talk to it?
Well, that's where things get kind of interesting. The ambassador can be deployed in a couple of different ways.
Okay.
One of the most common is as a sidecar.
A sidecar? Like those motorcycles.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. So in this case, the ambassador runs alongside your application,
Okay.
like in its own separate process or container. So it's like this, loyal companion.
So it's not part of my application's code.
Exactly. It's completely independent, but it lives like right next to your application. So the communication between them is super fast,
Oh, okay.
super efficient. Like imagine having a built-in translator who's always there to help facilitate those conversations.
Okay, I think I get it. Can you walk me through like how the communication actually flows? How does my application use this sidecar to, actually talk to that external service?
Sure. So imagine your application needs something, like it wants to access data from a remote API.
Okay.
So instead of making that request directly, it sends the request to the ambassador.
Okay.
And then the ambassador takes over. It handles all those like messy details, like adding security headers, encrypting the communication, maybe even retrying the request if there's a problem.
So the ambassador is basically intercepting all the outgoing traffic from my application.
Exactly. It's like a gatekeeper, making sure all the communication follows the rules, the policies that you've defined.
Right.
So once the ambassador has prepared that request, it forwards it on to the external service, gets the response, and then sends it back to your application.
So it's like a personal assistant for my application that just handles all the communication tasks.
Precisely. And the best part, your application doesn't even need to know that the ambassador exists.
Oh, wow.
It just sends those requests like it normally would, and the ambassador just takes care of the rest.
Okay. Clever. What about that other deployment option you mentioned, the shared service thing.
Right. So instead of having this like dedicated sidecar for every single application, you can deploy the ambassador as a shared service.
Okay.
And it handles the communication for multiple applications.
So like a central communication hub.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And this can actually be more efficient, in terms of resource usage. And it can also make it easier to manage and update the ambassador.
Okay, cool. So are there any downsides? This sounds like almost too good to be true.
Well, of course, everything has trade-offs.
Right.
One thing to think about is latency, because communication has to go through the ambassador now. There's a little bit of overhead.
So it's like adding an extra stop to your commute.
Yeah,
Not a huge delay, but yeah.
exactly. And you also need to think carefully about what functionality you put in the ambassador.
Okay.
You don't want to like overload it. It can get harder to maintain and debug.
Right. Too many responsibilities. So if I were to summarize the advantages of the ambassador pattern, what would you say are like the big ones?
I would say enhanced resilience, improved security, centralized management, and the ability to kind of like decouple your applications from all those complexities of external communication.
Okay. And this pattern isn't tied to any specific cloud provider or technology, right?
No, not at all. It's a general design pattern. You can implement it anywhere.
Right.
Cloud services, on-premise systems, even a hybrid setup.
That's great. So what are some real-world examples where I might use this?
Well, imagine you're building, a microservices-based application
Okay.
where you have all these small independent services that need to talk to each other. The ambassador pattern can really help you manage that communication, make sure it's secure, make sure it's reliable,
Okay.
even if those services are written in different languages or use different communication protocols.
So it's like a universal translator for my microservices.
Exactly. It can also be used to modernize legacy applications.
So.
Let's say you've got this like older application that needs to talk to some new cloud service.
Yeah.
And instead of trying to like cram all that new security stuff, all that communication logic into the old app, you could use an ambassador to kind of bridge the gap.
Right. Yeah.
So the ambassador can handle, TLS encryption, authentication, even protocol translation. It's like you're giving that old application a brand new communication system without, having to rebuild the whole thing.
Without ripping out the engine. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really neat.
Exactly. And beyond these examples, I think the ambassador pattern really shows how our thinking about building software has changed.
Yeah.
It puts decoupling, resilience, and security first.
So it's not just the technical part. It's like a whole philosophy.
Exactly. It helps us think about how our apps are going to, interact with everything else.
Right.
And how to build in like safeguards for all the crazy stuff that happens in distributed systems.
That makes sense. I mean, everything's so interconnected these days.
Exactly. And the ambassador pattern is also a great example of how patterns can help us talk about these complicated technical ideas more clearly.
Yeah,
Like when we all know the same patterns, it's like we're speaking the same language.
definitely.
Yeah.
Especially when you're working with, people who have different backgrounds and stuff.
Exactly. It's like we all have the same map and we can, navigate the terrain together.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. But, patterns aren't like rules, are they?
No, not at
They're
all.
more like guidelines.
Yeah. The best developers, the best architects are the ones who understand why the patterns work,
Okay.
and then they can adapt them to their needs.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, how do they get started with this pattern?
I would say, first, really understand the problem you're trying to solve.
Okay.
Like, what are you struggling with? Is it communication, security, resilience, management?
So don't just use a pattern because it sounds cool.
Right. Once you understand the problem, then you can see if the ambassador pattern's a good fit. And there's a ton of resources online, open source libraries, frameworks, all sorts of stuff to get you started.
That's great. So it's not a huge commitment to try it out.
Not at all. And hey, even if you don't end up using the ambassador pattern, the ideas behind it, decoupling, abstraction, separation of concerns, those are really useful.
Yeah. Good point. So even if you don't become an ambassador, you can still learn from it.
Exactly.
Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into the ambassador pattern.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground. We talked about, the technical details, the bigger picture, how it can help with resilience, security, management.
And how it can, bridge that gap between older systems and all the new stuff.
We've got a little philosophical, talking about the importance of, decoupling and abstraction and just thinking carefully about design.
Hopefully this has been helpful. And maybe it's made you a little curious to learn more.
Definitely. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep that passion for building great software alive. Until next time, everyone.